our last panelist of this session is Mr. Sharif Behruz, the representative of the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan in US and Canada. He earned his honor BA in political science at University of Western Ontario, and he regularly appears in Persian, Kurdish, and English media. He has also appeared before in the Canadian Parliament and US Congress to testify on the gross violation of human rights in Iran under the current Islamic regime. Mr. Sharif Behruz.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you all for being present on this Sunday that you could have been somewhere else, but I appreciate all you being present here. And also I'd like to thank representative panelists, political parties, and all of you on behalf of the Democratic Party of Iran and Kurdistan to be present on this historic day and at the same time tragedy for our people. I'd also like to take the time to thank the Iranian Human Rights Activist Association in York University, and as well as the Greater Toronto Kurdish House for being host for this event and to commemorate the 22nd anniversary of Dr. Ghassemlou's death. My topic will be mostly on terror and terrorism in respect to Dr. Ghassemlou's murder, and I would like to focus on the very vague legal definition of terrorism in my speech, and I hope it's not too confusing. On July 14, 1989, the French people celebrated the bicentennial of the French Revolution. As the French were celebrating their revolution 2 centuries later, the people in Kurdistan and Iran were preparing for the most tragic event in their history. July 13, 1989 is an appalling date for the people of Iran and Kurdistan. Dr. Abdul-Rahman Ghassemlou, who was preparing to celebrate the ideals of the French Revolution, was killed in Vienna, Austria, along with his aides on the supposed negotiation table with the mercenaries of the Islamic regime in Iran, who happened to hijack his revolution in Iran a decade earlier. The murder of this exceptional Kurdish-Iranian opposition leader, in which the regime's current president, a former guard commander, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's name has been dragged, is still shrouded in mystery more than 2 decades on. Putting justice aside, tragically, the world community is still struggling to define the act that Dr. Ghassemlou and countless other brave Iranians have fell victim to, namely terror, terrorist, and terrorism. Terrorism is not legally defined in all jurisdictions, and there's no universally agreed, legally binding criminal law definition of terrorism. Common definition of terrorism refer only to those violent acts which are intended to create fear or terror are perpetrated for a religious, political, or ideological goal. Here I refrain from going to the roots of terrorism, or why states and non-states resort to acts of violence and terror to achieve certain objectives. However, it's necessary to briefly define various attributes to the concept of terrorism, and then define terrorism in relation to the regime of Islamic Republic. And finally, illustrate whether Dr. Ghassemlou's assassination would fit into a typical definition of an act of terror. To begin, we need to distinguish 3 terms as related to terrorism. The word itself, terrorism, state terrorism, and state-sponsored terrorism. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines terrorism generally as the systematic use of violence to create a general climate of fear in the population and thereby to bring about a particular political objective. Following the terrorist bombings in US, Britain, Spain, Egypt, and throughout the last decades, prompted the United Nations and the international community to search for a mutually agreeable definition of terrorism. And the draft declaration of the United Nations Convention in 2005 only offered political, not a legal definition. And the quote begins, "We, the world leaders, affirm that the targeting and deliberate killing of civilians and non-combatants cannot be justified or legitimized in any way by any cause or grievance. And we declare that any action intended to cause death or serious bodily harm to civilians or non-combatants, when the purpose of such an act by its nature or context is to intimidate a population or to compel a government or an international organization to carry out or to abstain from any act, cannot be justified on any grounds and constitute an act of terror." The definition of state-sponsored terrorism is a term to be used to describe terrorism sponsored by nation states. As with terrorism, the precise definition and the identification of particular example are subject of heated political dispute. In general, state-sponsored terrorism is associated with paramilitary and organization resorting to terror for their political and ideological aims with the sponsorship of state actors. However, state terrorism may refer to acts of terrorism conducted by a state against a foreign state or people. It can also refer to widespread act of violence by a state against its own people. Another quote from Encyclopedia, and it begins, "Establishment terrorism, often called state or state-sponsored terrorism, is employed by government, or more often by factions within government, against that government's citizen, against factions within the government, or against foreign governments or groups." Terrorism as in relation to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Iran has been one of the world's most terrorist harboring states. Tehran has armed, trained, financed, inspired, organized, and otherwise supported dozens of violent groups over the years. Exporting the Iranian-style Islamist form of government around the world has been a leading foreign policy goal for the clerical regime in Iran. In addition to that, an ambition that led Tehran to work with a range of radicals around the world. Iran has backed not only groups in the Gulf, in its Gulf neighborhood, but also terrorists and radicals in Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, Bosnia, the Philippines, and elsewhere. This support not only remains strong even today, but also it has extended to newly liberated countries of Iraq and Afghanistan in the delicate process of state formation and steady democratic progress. The Ayatollah sponsorship of terrorism is the most point of concern to the international community. And sadly, when they refer to Iran as a terrorist state, only Iran's sponsorship of terror outside its borders irritates them the most. On the other hand, the regime in Iran, since its inception, has adopted a policy of terror, fear, and intimidation against its people and opponents. The Iranian regime, has used its paramilitaries, the siege force, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps to crush and eliminate its opponents across the country and beyond its borders. The regime and its repressive forces have engaged in the most vicious campaign of terrorization, which by all accounts has been unprecedented in the last 3 decades. Islamic Republic of Iran, a terrorist sponsoring state. Iran initially began supporting radical groups, including many that embraced terrorism after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and quickly became the world's leading state supporter of terrorism. Exporting the revolution was a leading foreign policy goal, an aspiration that led the regime to work with a range of radicals around the world. The clerical regime in Tehran viewed supporting revolution overseas as part of its revolutionary duty. The theological justification for the Iranian Revolution, espoused by the clerics, emphasized the spread of Islam regardless of state boundaries. In its chapter on state-sponsored terrorism, the State Department lists Iran as the most active sponsor of terrorism. Open quote,